History remembers kings, but sometimes a single teenage girl changes the fate of nations. I am the archivist. Tonight, we uncover the story of Joan of Arc, the peasant girl who heard mysterious voices, led armies into battle, and forced kingdoms to bow before her courage. What if a teenage farm girl suddenly claimed God had chosen her to lead an army? Imagine living during one of the darkest periods in French history. Devastated villages. Families starved. England controlled large parts of France during the 100 Years' War. Most people believed France was collapsing forever. But then a young peasant girl named Joan of Arc claimed she heard divine voices commanding her to save the kingdom. She was only a teenager with no military training, no political power, and no noble background. Yet somehow, this young girl convinced soldiers, nobles, and eventually even the French king to trust her. Joan would lead armies into battle, inspire desperate soldiers, defeat English forces, and become one of history's most legendary revolutionaries. But her story would not end with victory. Betrayed by political allies and captured by enemies, Joan of Arc would eventually face one of the most horrifying deaths imaginable. Joan of Arc was born around 1412 in the small village of Domremy in northeastern France. She came from a poor farming family during a time of constant violence and instability. The 100 Years' War between England and France had devastated much of the country. Villages were frequently attacked, crops destroyed, and civilians forced to flee violence. Joan grew up deeply religious and spent much of her time praying in church. Around the age of 13, she later claimed to begin hearing mysterious voices accompanied by bright visions of saints and angels. According to Joan, these voices told her that God had chosen her to help save France from English control. At first, she kept these experiences secret. But as the war worsened and French morale collapsed, Joan became increasingly convinced that her visions carried a divine mission far greater than herself. By 1429, France stood near collapse. English forces and their Burgundian allies controlled large parts of the kingdom, and many believed France would soon disappear entirely. Joan became convinced the voices commanding her were real and that she had been chosen to help save the country. She traveled across dangerous war-torn territory to meet the uncrowned French heir, Charles VII. At first, nobles and soldiers mocked her. She was only a teenage peasant girl claiming divine guidance during a brutal medieval war. Yet Joan displayed extraordinary confidence and determination. According to historical accounts, she correctly identified Charles while he disguised himself among courtiers to test her. Religious authorities questioned her intensely about her visions and beliefs. Eventually, despite deep skepticism, Joan received armor, weapons, and permission to accompany French forces. Against all expectations, a teenage farm girl had entered the center of French politics and war. The city of Orléans had been under English siege for months and was considered one of the most important battles of the war. If Orléans fell, many believed France itself might collapse. Joan arrived at the city carrying her white banner and immediately inspired exhausted French defenders. Soldiers who had nearly lost hope suddenly believed victory was possible again. Joan encouraged aggressive attacks against English fortifications despite the danger surrounding her. During one assault, she was struck by an arrow and badly wounded. Yet after receiving treatment, she reportedly returned to the battlefield carrying her banner once more. Her courage electrified French troops. Within days, French forces broke the English siege and liberated Orléans. The victory shocked Europe. A teenage peasant girl with no military training had helped lead one of the most important French victories of the 100 Years' War. After the victory at Orléans, Joan's reputation spread rapidly across France. Many now believed she truly carried divine favor. Joan insisted that Charles must travel to the city of Reims to be officially crowned king according to French tradition. The journey was extremely dangerous because enemy-controlled territories lay between them and the city. Nevertheless, Joan traveled with the French army through hostile regions, encouraging troops and civilians alike. Several towns surrendered without major resistance after hearing Joan was approaching. Her presence seemed to inspire confidence everywhere she traveled. Eventually, Charles reached Reims Cathedral where he was formally crowned King Charles VII of France. Joan stood nearby holding her banner during the ceremony. For many French citizens, the coronation symbolized the survival of France itself. A teenage peasant girl had helped restore legitimacy and hope to a kingdom that once seemed doomed. Although Joan achieved extraordinary victories, the war was far from over. Political divisions within France remained dangerous, and many nobles distrusted Joan's growing influence. Some feared her popularity threatened their own power. Joan continued participating in military campaigns against English and Burgundian forces, often placing herself directly in danger beside ordinary soldiers. Yet support at court gradually weakened. Failed attacks and political disagreements created growing tension between Joan and royal advisors. Despite her courage, Joan could not force the French leadership to act as boldly as she wished. Meanwhile, enemies increasingly viewed her as both a military threat and a dangerous symbol capable of inspiring resistance across France. The teenage girl who once seemed unstoppable now faced enemies not only on battlefields but also within political circles supposedly fighting on her side. In May 1430, Joan traveled to the town of Compiègne to help defend it against Burgundian forces allied with England. During heavy fighting outside the city walls, chaos spread across the battlefield as French defenders retreated. Joan stayed behind helping soldiers withdraw safely while enemy cavalry closed in around her. Eventually, she was pulled from her horse and captured by Burgundian troops. News of her capture spread rapidly across France and England. For her enemies, capturing Joan represented a major political victory. The young woman who had inspired armies and revived French morale was now a prisoner. Many French soldiers hoped King Charles VII would ransom or rescue her. But political calculations and fear increasingly outweighed loyalty. Joan, once celebrated as the savior of France, now faced imprisonment, isolation, and betrayal while her enemies prepared to destroy both her reputation and her life. After months of imprisonment, Joan was transferred to the English-controlled city of Rouen, where church officials placed her on trial for heresy. The proceedings were heavily political from the beginning. English authorities wanted to destroy Joan's reputation and prove her visions came from evil rather than God. Joan faced experienced judges, clergy, and legal scholars determined to trap her through endless questioning. Despite being only 19 years old, Joan answered many questions with remarkable intelligence and confidence. She defended her visions, her actions, and her faith even while threatened with torture and execution. Yet the trial was deeply unfair. Joan was denied proper legal protections and held in harsh prison conditions guarded by enemy soldiers. Over time, exhaustion, fear, and isolation weakened her resistance. The same girl who once stood fearlessly before kings and armies now faced an entire system determined to condemn her. On May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was sentenced to death. She was taken to the marketplace in Rouen where crowds gathered to witness the execution. Guards tied the 19-year-old girl to a tall wooden stake surrounded by firewood. Witnesses later described Joan asking for a cross to hold as flames were prepared around her. As the fire rose, many people in the crowd reportedly cried or turned away in horror. Even some English soldiers were disturbed by the execution. Joan died burned alive while repeatedly calling upon God. Her ashes were later scattered to prevent supporters from collecting relics. The execution intended to destroy Joan's legend forever. Instead, it transformed her into a martyr. The teenage peasant girl who once claimed divine visions had now become one of the most unforgettable figures in world history. Although Joan of Arc died at 19, her influence did not disappear. Over time, many French citizens increasingly viewed her not as a criminal, but as a hero and martyr who sacrificed herself for France. Years after her execution, new investigations ordered by King Charles VII re-examined the trial and declared it deeply unjust. Joan's conviction was officially overturned. As France gradually recovered during the later stages of the 100 Years' War, Joan became a national symbol of courage, faith, and resistance against foreign occupation. Artists, writers, and historians across centuries continued retelling her story. Ordinary people admired how a poor teenage girl challenged powerful armies and political systems despite overwhelming odds. Her legend spread far beyond France and became one of the most enduring revolutionary stories in human history. Centuries after her death, Joan of Arc's reputation continued growing around the world. In 1920, the Catholic Church officially declared her a saint. She became one of the most famous women in religious and military history. Joan's story inspired films, novels, paintings, speeches, and political movements across many countries. Historians continue debating the exact nature of her visions and military role, yet few deny her extraordinary impact. At only 19 years old, Joan changed the course of the 100 Years' War and restored hope to a collapsing kingdom. Her story remains powerful because she represented something rare: an ordinary person challenging enormous systems of power through belief, courage, and determination. More than 600 years later, Joan of Arc is still remembered not simply as a warrior, but as a symbol of resistance, faith, sacrifice, and the extraordinary power of conviction. The story of Joan of Arc remains one of the most extraordinary revolutionary stories in history. Born into poverty during the chaos of the 100 Years' War, Joan transformed from a teenage peasant girl into the unlikely leader of French armies at a time when France faced destruction. Guided by visions she believed came from God, Joan inspired exhausted soldiers, helped lift the Siege of Orléans, and restored hope to a collapsing kingdom through the coronation of Charles VII. Yet despite her victories, political betrayal and enemy capture eventually led to her execution in 1431. Burned alive at only 19 years old, Joan's enemies hoped to erase her forever. Instead, her courage transformed her into a lasting symbol of faith, resistance, sacrifice, and revolutionary determination. More than 6 centuries later, Joan of Arc continues inspiring people around the world as the teenage girl who dared to challenge kingdoms and change history forever.